Hi. Okay, good morning, everyone. We hope that you are surviving and thriving in the typhoon. What we're going to do is discuss urban design and placemaking this morning. And the goal of this lecture is to be part of your preparation for going to visit the sites on Wednesday that you'll be analyzing and working on as teams. So, first, let's start with a really simple definition of what placemaking is. So, a public place is an area where everyone, regardless of their background, can enter without permission. So, these are typical places like public squares, parks, streets, places that you frequent every day. But interestingly, not all public spaces are operated by the public. There's something known as privately owned public spaces, or POPs, and these are quite popular in New York City, and I also found an example, Times Square in Hong Kong, that's considered a privately owned public space. And typically this is done by developers in exchange for benefits, such as building higher or bulkier than typical planning regulations will allow. So private ownership doesn't necessarily mean that it's exclusively for public use, as you can see in these examples. Interestingly, Zuccotti Park in New York City, the photo to the right, is a POP, a privately owned public space, and the Occupy Wall Street movements back in 2010 and 2011 took advantage of these legal loopholes because it was up to the developer to evict people for trespassing and not the city government itself. So there are interesting legal opportunities through POPs. But moving on from the legalities of public spaces, let's review some of the 20th century tools that have been used for public space analysis. So the first person that we're going to talk about is a former MIT professor named Kevin Lynch, and he's well revered throughout my department and to some degree around the United States. So he's best known for the idea of mental mapping, and in some ways these are also considered imageability and wayfinding. He wrote a book called The Image of the City that was published in 1960, and it's a study on how observers take in information using American cities. So Kevin Lynch's mental mapping is made up of 5 components. But before I describe those 5 components, I want to emphasize that this is a universal tool. It's not specific to the US. This is a map from the prehistoric ages in Italy, and yet even today when we look at this map, we can understand what it's trying to tell us through the use of hieroglyphics and depictions such as the animal features, the buildings, larger buildings and smaller buildings, the ladder. So the use of mapping can be a wonderful universal tool. And so when we're thinking about maps, there's different scales that people can analyze spaces in, as you all are well acquainted with. The architects focus more specifically on the home space, whereas urban planners focus beyond the home at the street, city, and regional level. And the more you zoom out, the less detail you have, but perhaps the more context you might have. So here are Kevin Lynch's 5 elements, and these are described in words, and we'll also look at images in just a moment. So the 5 elements for Kevin Lynch's mental maps are paths, which are the streets, sidewalks, trails, canals, etc., and they arrange the space and movement between spaces. So you can imagine just walking along a street, and that's considered a path. The edges are boundaries. They can be real or perceived, such as walls or buildings, shorelines, and these are distinct places that you know you've crossed a particular threshold. Districts are typically larger areas, and they have common features. So for example, the central area could be considered a historic district. Nodes are often areas of gathering places, the focus of an area. So many of the transit stations, the MTR stations, could be considered nodes, and also some landmark buildings, such as particularly old buildings, the gathering space, not the building itself, could be a node. And then finally, there are landmarks, which can be buildings or public art or sculptures. These are places typically of reference points or gathering. So here are visualizations of his 5 elements. You can see the past to the left in red, and then you can see the edges, industrial areas or historic areas or construction areas, in the lighter red grayed out area. Then to the left we have nodes, and they are typically in the streets and centers where commerce and transportation come together. To our right we have districts, which might be a series of buildings or places or a particular design that has common patterns or features. And you can keep up with all of these in the top banner that shows the images for each one: the path, the node, the landmark, the edge, and the district. And then finally we have landmarks. In this example, churches are used, but also temples can be used, sculptures can be used, even mountains can be used to orient yourself. Typically landmarks are of a higher height. And so those are the tools that have been developed by Kevin Lynch. There's another famous American who developed more of an observational rather than graphic approach to public space analysis. And his name was William White, and he's most famous for the Street Life Project, which was published in 1980. What's interesting about William White is that he identified how hard, in fact, it is to create public spaces. So we have this quote here from White: "It is difficult to design a space that will not attract people. What is remarkable is how often this has been accomplished." And if you think to yourself of many of the green spaces that you pass by, and maybe some of the landscape architecture students, if you think to yourself about some exemplary projects, to what degree are they actually occupied and regularly used on a daily basis by people? And so in a moment, we'll view some clips of a video that will show you what William White was trying to get at in this quote. And he did his analysis through filming. He believed that design should start with a thorough understanding of the way people use spaces. So he wanted to go and find where the people were first, and then analyze those spaces by both filming, counting, and talking to people. So what we'll do now for the next maybe 10 minutes or so is view some of White's clips in his old movie. Well, let's start with the first couple minutes to orient you.
This is the plaza of the Seagram building in New York. Late morning. With a time-lapse camera, we were testing a hypothesis. The sun, we were pretty sure, would be the chief factor in determining where people would sit or not sit. Now, just after 12, they begin to sit. Right where the sun is. I was enormously pleased. What a perfectly splendid correlation. It was quite misleading, as we would see later, but it was a very encouraging way to start. We were studying the Seagram Plaza because it was one of the most popular. Many people didn't think that it would be, but it was, and we wanted to find out why. Our research group, the Street Life Project, had been observing other kinds of city spaces. One was a block of 101st Street in East Harlem. We didn't know it at the time, but almost every factor that later we were to find was important for a city space, we could have found out right here. The clues were right under our noses. We had studied play areas, such as this adventure playground. It was a very good one, too. Wonderfully messy, lots of dirt and mud and the water that kids love so much. Sometimes it was crowded, and this was a problem that we were very interested in because we had started out with a great concern over the problem of urban overcrowding. But the more we studied this play area and other play areas, the more we began to realize that the great problem of these spaces is not overuse, but underuse. Even this playground, a very good one, on a day like now, which is a beautiful day in July, sometimes is almost completely empty except for the play director. When we looked at the center of the city, we found underuse was even more apparent. Most office building plazas were empty most of the time, even at lunch on a beautiful day. Now, it wasn't meant to be that way. The city had been giving bonuses, floor space bonuses, to builders for providing plazas. If the builders did, they could add more floors to their building. And so they did. They built the extra floors and got all that extra money, and in return, they gave these empty spaces.
So, what we've heard so far from William White is that he is interested in studying public spaces and identifying where people gravitate to, where they want to be. And so, his main example is a building called the Seagram Building, which is in Midtown Manhattan. And then he follows up that comment and that observation of where the sunlight is and the perfect correlation with a look at a neighborhood street on 101st Street in a neighborhood in New York City called East Harlem. And what William White finds, I'll give away the ending now, but you'll see it in a moment, is that 101st Street had all of the elements that the Seagram Building and other public spaces were missing. Most egregious is just the lack of people, and we'll discover why that might be as we move through some of the other comments. So let's move ahead now to front ledge and steps.
At peak times, the front ledge is the most heavily used, especially by younger people who tend to the front. These elegantly simple steps are a very important feature. They're low and they're easy. They're easy to go up and down. They're also easy to sit on, and the corner has a right angle that's fine for groups. But there's a problem. The corners of the steps are precisely where the main flow of people to and from the buildings can be found. Yet this is where people like to stand and to sit and to block the traffic. They're usually a few feet here and there for passage, and though sometimes it does get a little difficult, and you have to pick your way very carefully. But it's a friendly kind of congestion, and later things do clear up a bit. Now we come to another junction.
So what William White is observing just then is the use of the front ledge and the steps. He comments that although it's very crowded and it appears to be difficult for people to navigate that space, in fact, it's where people want to be and they will make space for one another, and it makes it an attractive place in the city to be, relax, and see others going about their business. Next, we're going to look at why some plazas work, the element of seating and sitting. So let's move on.
We come to the question, why do some plazas work and others not? We rank 15 plazas by the average number of people sitting, running somewhere from around 170 down to about, a handful, 20 or 30. Now, most of these plazas are comparable in size. Why, then, the difference? Was it the amount of open space? No. If anything, there's a reverse correlation. What about sittable space? And here we get a bit closer. And had we ranked these in terms of qualitative sitting, we would have a much clearer relationship. We checked many other things: elevation, male-female ratio, spaces, and so on, chart and stupefying successes. But as we put them all together, one major finding began to shine through, and I now share it with you.
So I just want to emphasize very clearly that William White collected a tremendous amount of data on sunlight and time of seating and genders of people and where they're choosing to sit. But what he found is a very simple conclusion. People tend to sit where there are places available to them to sit.
Might not strike you as an intellectual bombshell, but this simple lesson is one that very few cities have ever heeded. They're tough places to sit in. And what's most aggravating are the number of plazas that would be excellent for sitting if only they weren't so high or wet or had fussy little railings placed to get you right in the small of the back. Here, another 2 inches and you'd be comfortable. Shrubbery and canted ledges, very useful for keeping people off. But we found that people are very adaptable. Press down on your heel and you can do it. Sometimes you got to play rough. But, as we found out, people are very adaptable. Older people like to sit in the sun here. Can't have that. Management put in these stones, and now the older people don't sit here anymore. This artifact is a design object, the purpose of which is to punctuate architectural photographs. It has some utility as a bench, but is usually placed in isolation. The dimensions are exquisitely wrong, not just for physical reasons, important as they may be. Small benches are socially awkward. If there's a crowd, people will sit, but they're not very relaxed about it. So to the first recommendation, make the place sittable. Minimum suggested requirement, 1 linear foot of sitting space for every 30 square feet of open space. It's easy to meet. They did it at Seagram's by leaving it sittable. Inherently, most places are, or should be. And for a lesson in this, let's go to St. Mark's Square in Venice.
So, William White mentioned that some governments don't want people to sit down, so-called perhaps undesirable people, especially the homeless, and they create design interventions to prevent their presence in public spaces. And we'll talk about the implications of that in just a minute. But let's move on to a different way of thinking about seating.
In this particular case, the social distance might be a little too close. We come to that wonderful invention, the movable chair. It's one of the reasons you have such a feeling of choice at places like Paley or Greenacre. You are doing the deciding. It's very interesting to watch how people manipulate chairs. Here you can sort of tell there's going to be a rather aggressive movement. Now, whatever the purpose of all this rearranging, it does make for a rather pleasant social ritual, and you'll see many variants of this, often quite lengthy. Even when there's no apparent functional reason of any kind, people move chairs. Watch this girl. Now, she's no more in the sun than she was before. Watch this fellow. Very unusual behavior. This man is starting something. Soon we're going to have a game of musical chairs. That's why these men all started to move. One could never know. But they did. The interesting thing, though, is about 4 minutes after the beginning of this, all the chairs were back where they started from. Fixed, individual seats don't work very well. For lovers, love seats are all right. The distances are quite comfortable, but not for most people. Furthermore, chairs like this are telling you, you sit here and you sit there. The most important thing about a space...
So, when we're thinking about movable chairs, the key takeaway from William White is that people like to be able to make their own decisions, even if it's moving the chair as little as 1 centimeter. Giving people autonomy makes them more comfortable and relaxed in that space. So although at the beginning of the movie, William White said that the sun doesn't seem to matter that much, it does still matter. And so let's take a few minutes to hear from him about the importance of sunlight.
People do like the sun. They so visibly like it, men as well as women. But we were pretty sure that sunlight would be a major factor, the major factor perhaps, in plaza use, and that a southern exposure would be almost a necessity. And for a while, it looked as if we were right. Our early time lapse, you'll recall, showed a very strong correlation between sitters and sun. That was in May. As time went on, June, July, August, the correlation vanished. People sat anywhere, sun or shade. Paley gave us another lesson. It lost part of its sun to a new office building. People came just as many as before. Sun was clearly not the ruling factor. Sun is most important in nippy weather, when the rays make the difference between sitting comfortably or not sitting. At Greenacre Park, the upper terrace is warmed by infrared heaters. Less costly is protection from the wind. Where it's provided, you can have a sort of nice sun theater. What hurts most is not so much the absence of sun, but of light. If we can't get the sun directly, perhaps we can borrow it. The same new buildings that are cutting off the sun in some places are reflecting it into others. As a matter of fact, some of the city's pleasantest lighting effects are from this kind of bounce light, particularly in the late afternoon. The new City Court building reflects sun with such a wallop that in one receiving block, trees are growing much faster than they did before.
So if it's not the sun per se that's important, according to White, it is the light. And there are really innovative ways that architects in the past have used light bouncing off of tall buildings to create pleasant light into new and different public spaces. Okay. Next, we're going to hear about scale.
Question. From city to city, are the basic factors pretty much the same? Answer, generally yes. But there is one key variable, scale. This is Phillips Square in Toronto. Very big place, but its proportions are right to the buildings around it. Here's another well-scaled place, the park that Seattle built over its freeway. It's quite large too, but it's experienced really on foot as a series of smaller spaces. Now we come to a smaller city, Lansing, Michigan. The best part of its new pedestrian mall is this one square, not very big, but quite comfortable in relation to its surroundings. Very pleasant. The tendency is to overscale. Here is the Mall of Riverside, California. Sometimes it is almost empty. Cities like Riverside, which are low density to begin with, need to concentrate. This mall disperses over a fairly large space activity and people in stores which, had they been compressed, might have come together in a critical mass. Here is a critical mass. This is Fountain Square, Cincinnati, which covers actually considerably less space than the mall that we just saw. And there are many, many more people in it. It's probably the best public square in the country. It has a close relationship to the street. It's well enclosed by the surrounding buildings. The designers have provided all kinds of choice, different kinds of sitting space, different kinds of places to eat. It's well programmed with activity. But most important of all, they put the space in the very center of town, not 5 or 6 blocks away, but at the 100% location. And this is why it is such a unifying place. Cincinnati comes together here. And you can touch the water. A public square that's indoors. The Crystal Court is the IDS Center in Minneapolis. It's nicely transparent, no black walls here. Connects well with the streets and stores and buildings around it. On the second level, there are walkways. They become quite a notable feature, helped by the fierce Minnesota winter climate and by very heavy pedestrian flows. Some smaller cities are copying the walkways, but without the heavy flows or the weather. They should look again. This place works because of its fundamentals, and they are the same for a space with a roof as one without. Like Fountain Square, this is right smack in the center of town. It shows in the people. That's why this is such a good place for looking at. There are all kinds, old people, young people, blue collar, white collar. You get quite a different feeling here than you do in a suburban shopping center. Here you are at the crossroads. In the old city of Boston, next to Faneuil Hall, some ancient market buildings have been made into the most successful marketplace in the country, and a very urban one. There are lots of highly specialized shops, every conceivable kind of food. The place is crowded and it's a bit messy. People sit all over the place. Notice how they're sitting on the steps, especially. It's quite energy efficient. These public spaces open out to the outside, and in good weather, these garage-type windows are rolled back to the open air. And almost always, even in the coldest weather, people will be sitting and eating outdoors. What we have here is the very opposite of the self-contained megastructure. The market is very much a part of downtown. The street, and you see the street going right through it. It was only after we had studied many other places.
So, in his discussion of scale, William White is emphasizing that it needs to be contextual or appropriate to the size of the city and the location that it is in within the city. Some of the parks he identified were just the right size for a smaller location, whereas others, like that large suburban shopping mall, were too large for the given population. In Boston, he's also mentioning, which is a site very familiar to Wendy Way and I, the Quincy Market Faneuil Hall area. And that is a very vibrant area because it is right in downtown at the crossroads of many different subway lines and tourist and local attractions. So when you're thinking about what types of public spaces to create, again, both the location is important and the quantity of people that will pass through that place is important. Too big and it won't be successful. And finally, we'll wrap up our discussion of William White with a return to 101st Street and what he found to be successful there.
But I realized we could have learned all of the lessons right here on 101st Street. It's an excellently scaled block, a comfortably sized space, very nicely enclosed, lots of people, and food. Very social activity too. Water? Yes, and you can touch it, you can aim it, you can slosh around in it. Sitting, best kind of space, slightly elevated. The lot at the corner is used for games, but the street itself is the #1 area for recreation, including that very popular form of polishing of the car. This block has its problems, but it works as a place. Here we are, back at Seagram. It's a hazy, muggy afternoon. Incidentally, that's the kind that always seems to bring people out, even more so than the nippy ones. A group of music students are giving a little impromptu concert. Some executives are still conferring. It's a very nice time. Just before 2 o'clock, everybody's about ready to close up. So we end our film on plazas, not on the plaza, but on the street itself. And that's where we should. The street is the river of life for the city. We come to these places not to escape, but to partake of.
Okay, so if you want to watch the full video on your own time, we will upload it so that you all can access it. But for now, that's going to conclude our discussion of the 20th century tools for public space analysis. And then you'll need to click on the next video for the second half of the lecture. I don't know how to get it to end. Oh, there.